Brutal Russian attack. Russia carried out the largest ballistic missile strike against Ukraine since the beginning of the war. The devastating attack, involving 458 drones and 45 ballistic missiles, caused power outages at all Ukrainian energy plants. In addition, the strikes affected Ukraine's gas and oil infrastructure. Combined with the desperate situation on the front, with Pokrovsk and Kupiansk completely encircled, Ukraine appears to be on the brink of collapse. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin the 288th live broadcast of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and remember to give us a thumbs up to fight censorship. On the other side of the screen from Madrid, Spain, joining us tonight, with a beardier look than usual, is Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are things over there?
Fernando Moragón. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien, efectivamente, aquí bien.
Well, yes, everything's fine here. I look a bit more bearded. I was going to shave today, to look a bit more presentable and all that. But in the end, I completely forgot and didn't shave. But anyway, tomorrow I'll grab the razor and look a bit more presentable. In my case, as you can see, since I'm not exactly known for extraordinary good looks, being shaved or unshaved doesn't make much difference. So yeah, there's no fixing that. That said, well, what also seems beyond fixing is the situation in Ukraine, at least from the point of view of the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and so on, who support them, because, well, things keep speeding up more and more. And as we've been saying, and we'll get into this calmly later, we're going to enter this winter in a completely different scenario from what we've had until now, where the Russian advances towards Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk will reach an unusual speed. And as you rightly pointed out, after an extremely harsh night of bombings, with the entire electrical system cut off. There it is, with the entire electrical system cut off. Some sectors have already been partially restored and so on, but this is going to be the daily or almost daily pattern this winter. So then, well, one of the heads of the energy sector over there already said the following. His name is Alexander Karchenko. He's the director of the Ukrainian Energy Research Center. And he said that if temperatures drop below -10, which indeed is quite possible, something that happens frequently in much of Ukraine during winter, well, if they drop below -10, the combined heat and power plants, as they are now, would shut down, because they don't have the energy capacity for more. And that would mean, among other things, the complete evacuation of Kyiv. That is, roughly 2.5 million people would have to leave because there would be no heating. In fact, this man goes on to add that if heating were not restored within 3 days, it would be necessary to drain the water from the houses and carry out a mass evacuation of residents. So this is what we're seeing and what Ukraine is facing.
Yes, a technical issue, perhaps not known to demolition workers from countries with temperate or even hot climates. Something, by the way, that I myself learned here in Germany. If the temperature drops significantly, as it indeed does in winter, and for some reason the heating system, which not only warms the houses, the interiors of the houses, but also heats the water, stops working, the cold causes the water in the pipes to freeze, and that immediately leads, due to the crystallization of the water, to the destruction of the pipes in houses, buildings, and public infrastructure. That's why all buildings here have special devices to control pressure according to temperature, but only within a certain range.
Según la temperatura, pero dentro de cierto rango. Si el agua desciende por debajo.
If the water drops below a certain number of degrees, around logically 0 degrees, the freezing point of water, although, well, due to pressure it can sometimes happen even above that, The frozen water in the pipes, well, the frozen water destroys all the plumbing. Therefore, the pipes for running water, for heating water. Let's remember that in Europe, generally, Europeans heat their homes with radiators that also use water, and even the drainage pipes. So, Fernando, this could lead to a total and absolute disaster.
Absolutely, absolutely. That would be, uninhabitable, unbearable, aside from the chaos it would cause. Imagine, for example, in the case of Kyiv, a city of more than 2.5 million people left without water, and everything you're describing happens. No, it's unlivable. You can't stay there. And then imagine evacuating 2.5 million people. That could be total chaos. In other words, well, every man for himself, right? And well, indeed, in those places, it doesn't even get that cold. As I said, in Ukraine, not in the southern part, which can also happen but is rarer, but certainly from the center upward, -10 is normal. Every year there are some days with -10, or quite a few. So the winter can be tremendous. It could even mean, if all this happens, the end of the Ukrainian regime and the complete collapse of its troops, the government, the total breakdown of all state structures of every kind, including the Ukrainian army.
Good question from Hugo Sanatiti. Where to? That's the question too, Fernando.
Good question, right? There are two options here. Well, two options. In short, two possible disasters, let's say. Where the Russians are focusing most is on attacking power plants of all kinds and conditions on the eastern side of the Dnieper. That is, the most likely thing to collapse fundamentally is that. It depends on how the situation develops. The whole system could collapse, but the most overloaded part is this one. It could happen that recovery is more or less possible on the western side of the Dnieper, which would mean they'd have to move toward Lviv, so to speak. That's if the entire system doesn't collapse. They could move toward the warmer areas to the south. But the most likely scenario is that if everything collapses, there would be a massive wave of migration forced by the conditions of the war and by the climate toward Europe. And then the Poles, Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, who would be the first to face it, and Romanians would have to figure out how to deal with it. Because until it reaches Spain, it's more complicated. But all of them would have to, and the European Union would have to manage a crisis that could trigger a domino effect. That crisis in Ukraine, when dealing with a massive wave of refugees, we could be talking about many millions more than in the first wave, could also mean the end of the European Union due to its inability to handle that influx of refugees. Let's not forget that during the first wave, with Russophobia at its peak, all Ukrainians were accepted without major issues and given all kinds of aid. That would no longer happen because many citizens, including the Poles, are fed up with the Ukrainians. And it's no longer popular. And not only is it no longer popular, but governments aren't very willing either, given the economic crisis we're facing in Europe, to make large expenditures to help refugees. In fact, what's happening now is the opposite. In Germany, in Poland, etc., they're saying they're going to send them back. In other words, that they should return there, that many of them are of fighting age, that they should fight in their own country, especially the Poles, who have a president who is quote-unquote quite anti-Ukrainian.
At this moment, Fernando, there are about 1 million Ukrainians in Germany since the beginning of the open phase of the war in 2022. 1 million Ukrainians have arrived here, in every corner of Berlin. Clearly Ukrainian voices. To me it sounds somewhat similar to Russian. I can't really tell the difference very well. The two languages are quite alike. On every corner, where you used to hear German and Turkish, because there are many Turks here in Berlin, or Arabic. Well, now you hear Russian or Ukrainian, most likely Ukrainian. As a personal anecdote, in my son's kindergarten, out of about 10 or 15 families, 3 or 4 are Ukrainian.
Well, just imagine, Ezekiel. Imagine that on top of that 1 million already there, another 2 million arrive, for example. That would mean an inability on Germany's part to manage a rapid wave caused by this winter situation, in which, well, it's hard to know for sure, but it's estimated that during the first year of the war, according to Ukrainian sources, between 4 and 6 million people left. The Ukrainians probably aren't counting those who went to Russia, but that would make it closer to 8 million. So imagine that out of the roughly 20 million people still in Ukraine, 10 million leave. And those 10 million are going to head toward the European Union, not Russia, because that's much more complicated. Well, the crisis in the European Union, with countries like Hungary already refusing to take in even a single refugee, not one, would have serious consequences. It could even mean the end of the European Union as such. In short, the tensions between states with different positions could lead to the definitive creation of a different European Union, and that would be the best outcome. That is, the only good thing would be for this monstrosity we know as the European Union, which is crushing us in every way, and is following a brutal, dystopian, Orwellian, or neo-Orwellian path to turn Europe into a totalitarian continent through measures like the digital ID they want to implement, where freedom and privacy would practically disappear, to be transformed. Therefore, I mean that of course the consequence all this could bring, even if it's speculative for now, is what the latest bombings, as Ezekiel mentioned, are showing us. They've been brutal. Now, if you want, we can go over everything that's come out.
A little bit about the map. Here's the infographic distributed and shared by the Ukrainian armed forces. According to them, there was an attack involving 400 drones and 9 missiles. But according to the Russians, and in this regard, they generally provide reliable information, the attack involved 458 Shahed or Geran drones, 3 Kalibr cruise missiles, 10 Iskander-K cruise missiles, 7 Kinjal aeroballistic missiles, and 25, which is, without a doubt, a record so far, 25 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, which are of course much larger and far more destructive. And, evidently, this reflects the state of Ukraine's air defenses. They can strike with these very large ballistic missiles, in the case of the Iskander-K, without much deterrent capability, simply a big, very fast missile that in the absence of defenses causes the destruction of very large targets, such as electric, thermoelectric, or hydroelectric plants. Here we also have the image of one of the first attacks, very small, and then this atrocity, Fernando.
Notice how they are more or less concentrated in the eastern part of Ukraine, because in recent times, let's say, the Russians have decided to focus mainly on that area and on all the energy, weapons, and other systems in the eastern part in order to collapse it. That's where the fighting is taking place and where the front line is, and so on. In the Kharkiv region, the Smyrna thermal power plant was hit. In
the Kharkiv region, the Slobozhanska thermal power plant was also hit. In the city of Kharkiv itself, there were massive blackouts lasting many hours. In the Kirovohrad region, the Kremenchuk hydroelectric power plant was struck. Rail and electrical services, logically, were also completely disrupted. There were attacks on locomotive depots, transport infrastructure, and railway infrastructure in Hrbinki, in the Poltava region, and in Horishny Plavny, also targeting railway infrastructure, causing widespread blackouts. This possibly, according to the outlet, was due to the proximity of the Kremenchuk power plant.
Este medio por la cercanía de la central eléctrica de Kremenchuk, también apagones masivos
There were also massive blackouts in practically all the regions located to the right, east of the Dnipro River. Attacks on oil and gas processing facilities in the Kharkiv and Poltava regions, facilities set on fire in Belsk, Bystra, Chernihiv, and at the Talalivka gas condensate or liquefied gas field. In addition, several hits on the Pridniprovska thermal power plant and drone attacks on energy facilities in Odessa and Mykolaiv. The largest attack since the start of the special military operation, mainly due to the massive use of armed missiles. Also, very interesting here, Fernando, this image showing the affected electrical infrastructure.
Yes.
And how these attacks, especially those located on the right bank of the Dnipro River, first caused power outages in many places, and on the other hand, an overload in the few areas that were still connected, in addition to the destruction of a great deal of infrastructure. Some very interesting videos were shared, even showing trams exploding due to the electrical overload on the lines. This is the map released by the Ukrainians themselves. Fernando, what's your take on how this combines with the advances on the front line? Why now? What analysis can we make, as I show background images of what happened between yesterday and today?
Well, yes, indeed. The first thing to say is that this is the usual situation. Let me explain. Since August, or even earlier in July, we had already been seeing these daily attacks. Now a record has been broken because more missiles of all kinds and types have been launched. But in general, with more or fewer missiles, with more or fewer drones, 450 drones, it's no small thing. With the H&M2 type, well, this is the usual pattern. Sometimes there are more, sometimes fewer, but there's no night, or sometimes day, when there isn't a good shower, so to speak, of drones, missiles, and so on. Sometimes records are broken, like now, but what it is something routine. That is to say, and this, I've understood it implicitly, it means a systematic, complete destruction of some power plants or certain targets that, it must be said, are holding up quite well. I mean, this speaks very highly of the Soviet Union in terms of the strength and resilience of its constructions. Because, for example, among those that were attacked last night, the one in Kremenchuk has been hit so many times that no one even knows how many anymore, just to give an example. And it's still standing with repairs. Some parts probably no longer work, and so on. But to destroy it, they've had to launch an enormous number of drones and missiles. As I said, this really speaks well of the strength and resilience of Soviet constructions. I don't know if the same thing would happen in the West, if they would endure that much. I don't think so. This, as I said, is a progressive situation until a moment comes, we don't know when, depending on the attacks and on how damaged the Ukrainian power grid already is, when there will be a blackout like the one that happened in Spain, but more brutal, more savage. That is because the power grid will be overloaded, there will be an imbalance, and boom, all of Ukraine will go down the drain. From there, it might be possible to restore it, maybe in some areas. Well, at first it would be most feasible to restore it in the western part, in the UOF area, etc., which would be less damaged. But a moment will come, and the Ukrainians themselves are saying it, when repairs will no longer be possible. And they complain a lot about the Europeans who are sending them materials for these repairs that are completely useless. Why? Let's not forget we're talking about Soviet-era power plants, which use a different kind of technology than the Western one. And that's why I say we're going to enter a decisive stage this winter where we might even see, well, practically the end of the war, because there's panic among the Europeans, and so on. Then, and this is also important, how does it affect the front? I mean, all this, of course, you say I cut power to the trains and so on.
Deselectrifico trenes y tal. Claro, trenes que muchos de ellos
Of course, many of those trains are used to transport all kinds of logistical supplies, food, ammunition, and so on. Everything needed at the front. If you don't have trains, you have to do it by truck. But, and here's the catch, the Russians aren't just attacking electrical infrastructure. They're also hitting gas depots, refineries, and so on. This means that the diesel for the trucks, for example, isn't available either, or there's very little of it. In the end, let's not forget that war, beyond the ferocity, the fighting capacity, and the combat morale of the soldiers, depends heavily or entirely on logistics. Logistics is everything. If your logistics collapse, it's over. That is, you're going to have a lot of trouble holding out. In fact, it's already starting to collapse. There are already serious problems not only in Pokrovsk, which is under siege, and in fact, one of the problems and one of the changes in the current war compared to that of 2022, just to give us an idea. Notice that we're not saying, no, it's that war has changed a lot since World War II until now. Well, yes, of course it has changed a lot. No. We're talking about how the war has changed since the special military operation began in 2022 until now, that is, in 4 years. It's drastic. To the point that, well, there you can see the images. People moving through the streets in the dark. What we're seeing are the headlights of cars, and this, well, aside from the chaos, crime, and so on that it can cause, if that continues over time. But as I was saying, the change from the 2022 war to now is brutal, absolute, complete. And look at how things are. The little that reaches Minogratz's supply line from the Ukrainians, the little that can get through, they don't send it by truck, which is unfeasible. They send it with transport drones, aerial drones that carry a certain load, and boom, they drop it. In fact, the front line and the area around it, roughly 30 kilometers on each side. Trucks can't make it anymore. They just can't get through, because if a truck tries to supply its troops, it gets destroyed in no time. So what happens? They have to supply them with ground and aerial drones. But this is already happening. I mean, it's not something you can just say, no. Right now, for the units that are at the front or near the front, it's the only way to supply them. Because, let's not forget, due to the drone war, we no longer have compact units of an entire battalion stationed in one place, right? Now what we have are 2 people here, 4 there, 3 soldiers here, another 2 over there, and you have to supply them individually. Send a small drone to drop off water, food, ammunition, whatever they need. And quickly too, because enemy drones are lying in wait for these drones.
That last image you just showed, Fernando, small at first, now enlarged with the same video but from another source. Incredible. The whole city is dark, and it's a big city, relatively important.
And the lights must be from people who have some kind of generator or something like that, I don't know. But anyway.
Yes. Even some emergency lights, sometimes with a small battery, produce a little light, something like that, but nothing more than that, for a few hours.
But it reminded me of what you were saying earlier about Germany, about the problem with cold temperatures and all that. And it reminds me, for example, that in Russia, which is farther north, or well, part of it is farther north, most of it is farther north than Ukraine, and it's colder, well, they're very clear about it. They take advantage of the summer, the months of July and August, mainly September and June, to do all the repairs. For example, in Moscow, all the repairs to the hot water and gas systems are done then, because during that time, when the temperatures don't require heating or anything like that, they can afford to have them turned off. And I've seen that myself, suffered it, so to speak. During the summer, district by district, area by area. They cut off the gas, fix it in a few days, then cut it again somewhere else once that's been repaired, and they have to make the most of it. Same with the roads. Well, what do roads have to do with gas or hot water? Nothing, but they have the same effect. In the north, the roads, as soon as a little water falls on them, no matter how good the pavement is, even if there's just a small crack, if water gets in and freezes, it will expand that fracture and end up creating a huge split. So they have to do the same thing in summer, resurface, rebuild the vast majority of the roads.
Music.
Sí, perdón.
And on top of that, Russian music, let me tell you.
Y además música rusa, ni te quiero contar.
They're already crucifying us, and on top of that, they were playing Russian music. They're pro-Russian, they're this and that, whatever. They should be thrown in jail. It's a network that goes from Berlin to Madrid and runs all across Europe.
I'm still waiting for the payments from Russia and China, because so far I haven't received a cent.
This is a disaster.
This, like pro-Russian outlets, this is a disaster. Let's move on to something else, because we're not making a cent here. This is terrible. But anyway, indeed, more footage, bombs, explosions, detonations. This is the plant, this in Kharkiv, heavily hit. First the tremendous explosions at the power station, and after one last blast, everything went dark. Spectacular, huh? Kharkiv, completely in the dark. Well, more footage here. This, at the plant, at the Slobozhanske thermal power station, also completely in flames. We could go over the front line too, Fernando.
Now let's get to it, because all of this, it's a situation where this week the front has shifted a great deal, always in terms of a war of attrition, and above all there's a progression that the Ukrainian communists are already describing as very worrying, extremely worrying, toward the west in the region, in the area of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk. There the resistance the Ukrainians are putting up is very weak. It makes sense, we'll explain it now. So, keep in mind that there's no real front line there anymore. This is important. While in other places, for better or worse, more or less, the Ukrainians have a front line, with the Russians on one side and them on the other, here they don't anymore. What they have here are isolated units, in some of these villages, in this or that city. But there's no longer a real front line, and therefore there's very little coordination between those units. So, well, we were seeing... Well, now we don't see anything, but we were hearing it there.
I was just showing videos, and obviously nothing on the screen, right?
Just an image. Right now you could hear the noise of the traffic, or whatever it was, from the city.
Oh, this platform, well, but let's... There, you can see the cars. This is in Zaporizhzhia, everything in darkness. Everything, what a thing. This platform, sometimes showing things here as if it were being projected to all of you, and suddenly you're seeing something else. What a serious mistake. Well, over here, where else? Just now, some spectacular images.
Also, me talking like a fool about... No, in Dnipropetrovsk, can I tell you where the main attacks on the Estigas have been? Kharkiv. I'm reading, okay? In Kharkiv they got hit, but I'm checking right now. Tremendous. In Dnipropetrovsk and Kryvyi Rih there too.
This thing in Kharkiv, I'm commenting on it, but obviously, you can see the explosion there, the detonations mentioned earlier, and suddenly everything goes dark. Anyway, Fernando, how about we start with the advances in Dnipropetrovsk, in Zaporizhzhia, and so on.
Alright, where do we start? From the south, from the north? What do you prefer? You're the military man here, dear Fernando, so... No, it doesn't matter. Well, let's start from the north and go down to the south, which is the main part, where the mess is, more of a mess. So we basically start with Boden, because Sumi isn't worth it, since right now, yes, there's an exchange of shelling and all that, but in Sumi there's no... There it goes, the music.
Yes, many, but many attacks with fab bombs. This is a Fab 3000 recorded today.
And importantly, pay attention to when the shockwave goes off, because sometimes you can see it very clearly. That is, not just the explosion itself, the place where it detonates, but also the explosive charge and the shockwave, because the shockwave kills almost everything within it, any living being.
That building is practically completely destroyed. The entire central area of the building is completely demolished. And that's saying something, since it's one of those extremely sturdy buildings, the Soviet-style panel buildings.
We're talking about a 3-ton bomb, which is no small thing. In other words, it's enormous. So, well, we're seeing this everywhere. As I said, Volchansk, if that's the right pronunciation, if you look at the map, what's left of the city itself is just a little piece there. Then we'd basically move on to the outskirts of the city and then to other towns or villages. In other words, what's left there is all they have left. So most likely next week the Russians will be able to announce that they've finished taking Volchansk, which, as I said, has been extremely difficult for them. It's taken them 1 year and 7 months since this whole thing began. But anyway, this is the result of that strategy of 1,000 cuts we've talked about many times. That is, why has this been able to happen when we've been in a stagnant situation for many months? Well, because, actually more than 1 year of stagnation, precisely because they've had to withdraw units from here to reinforce other sectors of the front. And that has caused, with less opposition and less resistance, the Ukrainians to have no choice but to pull back from the positions where they were fortified in the center of Volchansk, in this case, and they've ultimately had to retreat in the face of the Russian advance, because they are fewer in number and have fewer capabilities. In other words, because, as I said, they've had to move units to other parts of the front, and we're going to see this almost everywhere. And this is due to several factors. A. Logistics are getting worse and worse, which means logistics also include the transport of troops to different areas. B. We also have the fact that the Ukrainians have fewer troops. There are fewer and fewer of them. I think the other day we were talking about the latest figures on deserters, mind you, deserters, which already add up to about 300,000. This is a disaster. That is, for a long time now, since last year, the Ukrainian army has had fewer people, let's say being forcibly recruited or whatever, plus those who flee, than those who arrive and stay, so to speak. In other words, they have a problem. They have fewer and fewer troops. They're not able to replace their losses with new cannon fodder supplies. That is to say, and it's becoming noticeable, they have fewer people, while the Russians are experiencing the opposite. They have more. We were talking about how, in the case of Pokrovsk, for example, the overall superiority around Pokrovsk was about 8-1, but in some specific areas, Ukrainian sources themselves indicated it was more than 20-1. Of course, in the end, this inevitably shows. If we add that the Russians have been steadily increasing their capabilities, that's why we were talking about 2022. In 2022, the Russians had 4 drones. Right now, the Russians are producing drones as if there were no tomorrow, in truly massive quantities, at an incredible industrial scale. And let's not forget that the Chinese are also supplying or selling them drones. And China's industrial capacity is extraordinary, beyond extraordinary, really. The other day, last Friday, we were talking with Santiago, about how they had just signed a contract with one of the largest companies in the military sector to buy, as casually as if they were buying peanuts, 3 million drones, with a single company, mind you, meaning they're ordering even more. That's the Chinese for you. But the production capacity of these relatively small drones, the ones used on the front lines, the helicopters we've seen many times, and so on, is tremendous. And besides, these are drones you can easily sell as civilian drones, because in fact they are. With a few small modifications, you can turn them into military drones. Of course, this means that Russia, and the one backing Russia, which is China, have an industrial arms capacity, and in this specific case, a drone capacity, in a war that has already become fundamentally a drone war, in which there is no comparison.
I mean, the West can't. 3 versions to your right, Fernando. Ah, look. In blue, the formally declared desertions, and in red, the unauthorized abandonments of the place of service. Basically, a desertion not yet formalized as such, but a desertion in most cases. There may be some who want to resolve a problem and then return, but that's uncommon.
Well, look at that. It's incredible how much it's gone up. In 2021, which would be the reference point before the war, what was the average number of desertions when there was no war? There we have 117 and 2028. So if we go to the other extreme, we can see how it's been rising. 2022, well, a little more. 2023, a little more. 2024, it really goes up a lot. And look, in 2025, there's a qualitative leap. Well, quantitative, but mostly quantitative, that it's taken. That is the figure, according to what I'm reading here, 161,461, plus the 21,000, let's say, already official, declared as deserters and therefore wanted by the government's justice system. This is important.
10 months before the end of 2025, still.
In 2 months, there will still be more. So, well, of course that's normal. This is because in 2022, all the volunteers, that is, everyone who wanted to volunteer to fight for Ukraine and against Russia, came forward in 2022. And in 2022, all the people who wanted to go as volunteers were used up. From that point on, everyone has been forced. And another thing that's important and that we often forget is that you might say, well, but if I still take the roughly 20 million Ukrainians there are, and look at how many are in the male age range, well, that's it. In Ukraine, there are already many. Women can volunteer, and there are already many women's units, even in combat. Anyway, you say, I'll take the men of military age. From 23, I think that was the last reduction they made, up to 60, that's it. And you say, well, that's it, I can send all of them. No, not at all. Let's not forget that if you want to maintain a minimal state structure, you have to keep a lot of people, not to mention private companies, which are essential because they're the ones producing all kinds of things. But still, you have to keep a minimum number of people for it to function. On top of that, you need to have police to maintain public order in case there are protests, and to keep basic services running, water, gas, and so on. Maintenance and repair. You have to keep hospitals and schools running. You can't just shut them down and say, that's it. I mean, when you start counting, there are a lot of people who, even if they're of military age, you simply can't do without. For example, if there's a bombing, who's going to go put out the fire at a factory or a power plant that's been hit? The firefighters. You can't send the firefighters to the front, for instance. That's just one example. And as you keep adding things up, in the end, the number of people who can actually be mobilized without collapsing the state is very small. It's really not that many. So, how do you think about that? Well, I think Ukraine is reaching the limit of its mobilization capacity. The only thing left for them, but that's just a short-term fix, would be to lower the mobilization age to 18. But well, considering that there are already people who are, well, they're giving all kinds of incentives to those between 18 and 23 to enlist as well. And watch out for the flight issue, because that's not talked about much either. We're already talking about tens of thousands. The flight of people who are 16 or 17 and say, of course, I can tell they're going to lower it to 18. So at 17, look, I'm going to Europe and we'll see. Later when the war is over, I'll come back. Or maybe not. And that's what we were talking about. And you already said it. I remember the first time we talked about this was about a year and a half ago, something like that. The problem Ukraine has, and that's why it's a failed state, regardless of what happens in the war, even if it ended tomorrow, is that Ukraine has an issue that goes beyond the conflict. As a failed state, it's demographically unsustainable. Remember that dramatic population pyramid, with a severe narrowing among those roughly between 18 and 35 years old. In other words, the people of reproductive age, with a birth rate, mind you, this was already the case before the war, of about 1.3 or so. That is, even before the war, Ukrainians were already having few children.
Negative, certainly. Less than 2.1, a negative reproduction rate, because they simply don't have enough children to maintain and sustain the existing population. 2 would be logical, 1 for the father and 1 for the mother, and the 0.1 accounts for infant mortality. Less than 2.1 then means a population pyramid in decline.
In decline, as is happening throughout Europe. In Europe, we don't have children, so in the end, the base keeps getting narrower.
Because very few children are being born. Still very low, even by European standards. Even by European standards.
In European terms, it's very low. That's why I say that if you take into account immigration, whether due to war or previously for economic reasons, toward Europe or other places, what the war now represents, with the death of men between 25 and 60 years old, generally between 25 and 50 or 45, those who die the most, well, you have a country that is not demographically sustainable, that won't have people to work. In fact, some outlandish ideas were already being floated, which make no sense, like, no, well, let's go to Africa and fill this place with Africans. Not even Ukrainians anymore. We'd turn this into Afro-Ukraine or something like that.
And they wanted to bring people from Bangladesh into the classes.
And from Bangladesh too.
With banners in the classrooms, from India and Bangladesh.
And from Bangladesh, that's it, since I don't have population data from a country that used to be part of the Soviet Union, on one hand, but well, as a republic integrated into the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that we're lucky to have the last population census of the Soviet Union, which was in 1990, that is, a year before its dissolution. So we can more or less get an idea. It had, if I remember correctly, 53 or 54 million. We're talking about a territory that has gone from those 53 to 54 million to around 20, because we have to subtract those on the Russian side. And that's not a small number. In fact, Crimea and Donetsk were among the most populated regions within what used to be Ukraine. So they're losing the most populated areas, except for Kyiv and a few large cities like Kharkiv, etc. But well, Kharkiv is going to end up in Russian hands. I'm absolutely certain about it. They're losing the most populated areas. Then it's unsustainable. I mean, even if the war ended tomorrow, literally tomorrow, Ukraine, with a tremendous economic crisis, no population, and people who will keep leaving because it's logical too, has no future at all, zero. I mean, it's a state that will disappear demographically speaking. If this can't be solved, assuming the European Union were in a position to do so, which it isn't, in fact, there are already huge clashes because the EU member countries are tired of handing out money. And that's the reason they want to seize and the Belgians have refused the famous funds confiscated from the Russians, assets of all kinds and sorts. Of course, that's what it's about, because the European Union is already in a tremendous internal crisis. Really tremendous. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. Another thing is that the European Central Bank is artificially keeping us afloat by buying debt from various countries. France, Italy, Spain. But come on, this isn't sustainable. Well, now, handing out money is getting harder and harder for a European Union that, let's not forget, is giving out less money this year than last year. For reference, 2024 to Ukraine. I mean, because things are already tight, despite von der Leyen, who honestly would leave us all stripped bare and starving. But anyway, no, despite that, there's just nothing left, or very little. So, well, and that's with the massive cuts they're hitting us with, and the ones still to come. Huge ones, with increases in retirement age, with pension cuts. But anyway, in the end, there's only so much you can do. Even if you impose brutal austerity, aside from the fact that people will start protesting, there's just nothing left to squeeze. I mean, Ukraine therefore has a future. I'd say, look, Ukraine has no future. It has no future. And that's where we are. Now that the European Union, the neocon warmongers in the United States, both Democrats and within the Republican Party, couldn't care less, that they're thrilled about this. Fine, but this is a disaster. It's a disaster for Ukraine, a disaster for Europe, and also a disaster for Russia. That's just how it is. I mean, it's a great deal for the United States. That's also how it is. In the case of the Americans, they're making a killing by having us pay them and buy everything from them, especially gas and weapons. But not only that. Well, it's a situation we're going to suffer. We're already suffering it. I mean, you can feel it. It's gradual for now, but the time will surely come in connection with that breakup of Ukraine, with that final collapse, when it will spill over into Europe. And from there, anything is possible. Absolutely anything.
Without leaving the analysis aside, a quick note about Germany, in line with the discussion. Pay attention to this, dear Fernando. This is from Bild, the newspaper with the largest circulation in Germany and Europe, and at one point even in the world, if I remember correctly. A lowbrow yellow press rag, but widely read. And with this news, pay attention. The biggest price increases at the start of the new year, or for the coming year. Rates rise by up to 424% in the illustration. These are the garbage workers, here dressed in orange. Berlin, as if inflation weren't already bad enough, at the beginning of the year, a wave of price hikes is hitting Germany. Water, garbage, public transport, local transport, everything is getting even more expensive, up to 424%. Cities and towns are struggling under the weight of rising expenses and falling revenues, so the money has to come from somewhere. Well, Bild took random samples and listed the worst price increases: garbage, water, parking, bathrooms, which here they call pools, apparently in this translation, so to the public pool. The dog tax, here everyone dog owners, with a tax, buses, trains, telephone. Well, the whole package for the new year, like a little Christmas gift.
And then, according to the Germans, they're toasting with champagne over there saying, Happy New Year. Cheers. You already have the new tax rates we're going to impose, and you can start paying directly on day one.
So like at the supermarket, for the first time since my stay in Buenos Aires, the price surge this past month. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
He's already arrived, and they almost had 7 heart attacks in a row.
Yes, no. The supermarket is clearly more expensive. The situation here is terrible, unsustainable. When I present this in Latin America with friends, even in Argentina, people are incredulous. No, not in Europe. That thing about rising prices in supermarkets, public services, people picking up trash in the streets, people without a home. No, impossible. Everyone still has the idea of Europe from the 1950s and 60s, of course, the welfare state. That's gone. My friend.
That disappeared. But also, indeed, on top of that, Germany, which has always been the engine of Europe, which has sold itself as the model of the welfare state, of great industry, of everything, of major trade, and so on. And now this decline of Germany, because the southern countries have always been poorer. So, well, the thing is that the Spanish, the Italians, the Greeks, you know how it is. Besides, people from Northern Europe criticize us a lot for this. They say, those are a mess, a bunch of spendthrifts. But Germany, which used to be the model of saving, of austerity, of everything, well, right now, even the Germans themselves don't recognize it. It's a disaster, as Ezequiel Bistoletti rightly pointed out, since he's living it firsthand, and in recent years it's been in free fall, in a nosedive. And meanwhile, Chancellor Merz is saying, look, no, we have to help Ukraine, and therefore schools, education, healthcare, these things will have to be cut. Pensions, well, those too. In other words, the blow and the collapse hit harder in a country that has lived very well and is now starting to live very poorly. Because in a middle ground country like Spain or Italy or the South in general, well, we've lived well, but not as well as in Sweden, Norway, or Germany. So let's say you feel it less. But those who have lived, in grand style, with luxury and all kinds of social benefits, you probably know this better, but years ago in Germany, as was also the case in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, you had benefits. There were, I remember in the UK specifically, people who would say, no, I live off benefits in the UK. And you could actually do that, right? In the last century, I mean, if I have housing benefits, food benefits, whatever else, well, students who were studying there would say, no, I've arranged things so that I practically don't have to spend any of my own money. Or by working a little, because I have a bunch of benefits. Working a few hours is enough for me to study and live. This is unthinkable now. Well, in Germany's case, it's going to be tremendous because of that. Because the decline is steep. What Merz is doing is making it worse. But I also think it's a mix of Merz's own stupidity, as he has shown many times. And then let's not forget, Merz is not a man serving Germany's interests. Merz is a man serving BlackRock's interests, to put it simply, and ultimately those of the United States.
And the passivity of European societies as the backdrop.
That's the most terrible thing. That's the most terrible thing. Well, this whole thing that's been said, I just start talking about one thing,
And I end up talking about back to the front, dear Fernando Moragón.
At the forefront.
List closed.
Well, now let's go. This area is getting more and more filled in. The Kharkiv area, which is right here on the corner, they're advancing. I mean, they're not major advances, but they keep moving forward. In recent days, progress has continued in this area in such a way that what Ezequiel points out is becoming more consolidated. Here's this advance, this large encirclement. It's not a real encirclement. It was too large and the advance is small. But at a certain point, as Ezequiel very clearly shows with the red line, there are some logistical centers that are farther away. That is, this area isn't very populated or full of large cities. Well, we have progress that could be very fast. What you see here in gray is already taken, meaning it's already in Russian hands. And those advances are still happening there indeed. With a solid line, what we're going to see this week is that this will keep moving forward. This small pocket will gradually close. There's practically no one there. In fact, the few Ukrainians who are there are withdrawing and will realign the front, meaning they'll make the front more or less a straight line. as much as possible. And here we can see it. Careful, because the advances could be very fast, since the Ukrainian position isn't very large. They don't have major strongholds here.
No es muy grande, no tienen grandes lugares aquí. Lo que hablábamos de la estrategia de los mil cortes.
What we were talking about regarding the strategy of 1,000 cuts. At a certain point they can advance very quickly, for example in this sector, because most Ukrainians are no longer here, they're in other sectors doing what they can. That's why this sector, pay attention, could bring many surprises in the coming months. And then we move down to Kupiansk, depending on the sources one or another, but roughly 75% of the city at least is occupied, because as you can see, these gray areas, also in the eastern zone, are in Russian hands as well. In other words, what's left of Kupiansk as such is very little. Another thing is that, as the Russians advance southward along the Oskil River, you come across towns, cities, and so on that are important and almost right next to Kupiansk. But as for Kupiansk, it's practically taken, and right now the problem they have is the encirclement of this whole area, split in two by this red stretch we see, which is dividing it with a river behind it, where there are no bridges left. And as we've said many times, it's very difficult to get out of there now, made worse by the fact that the policy in Pokrovsk, but not only in Pokrovsk, generally, of the Ukrainian command is to hold out until the end. Not to withdraw to a second line to rear positions to form a new line. No, to give up territory. What happened? We've talked about it many times. What happened was they lost territory. That is, if this... Look, there's one of those bridges.
Improvised pontoon bridge. First with drones, and with drones they made holes, but not full destruction. There. More holes, until they called in the aviation guys with this, and now it's really goodbye bridge. Goodbye bridge indeed. On the left, the railway bridge completely destroyed. This one, the bridge, that part of the bridge there, completely destroyed. The pontoon bridge, right? Yes, a pontoon bridge along the line of the bridge, a bit old. Of course, along the line of the old bridge, and now nothing left.
Sure, well, this thing about holding on until the end without a clear way out. Yeah, that. And on top of that, you'll be able to swim less and less because the river keeps getting colder. So you had to wait for it to freeze because it really does freeze in winter. The ones who are here in this area, well, of course, not so much.
It doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. A swampy area, Fernando. Here, to the right, another branch, small islets. All of this is a delta, a swampy area without a more or less established path like this one. Hardly passable.
Nothing. This is in the end an uncoordinated and individual escape. That is, 2 or 3 soldiers at most, trying to survive however they can, either to get out of this siege or simply to surrender. I mean, there's no point in keeping this up. Now, the Ukrainians don't care. I mean, the Ukrainian leadership and the military leadership as well, both political and military, Zelensky and Syrsky couldn't care less. So they have to keep selling and promoting the idea that they're winning or at least not losing. Well, fine, but this is a disaster. Moreover, it's a preventable disaster, or at least partly preventable. This is lost. So there's no possibility of, well, after changing things. Anyway, what we're going to see here is moving down south. If we go down south, there aren't any major advances here. We'll go straight to Lyman, because the next to last thing about Lyman is an advance. You can see it clearly there. An advance that's no longer this one from the southeast, more or less, though that too. But they're already starting to reach the outskirts of Lyman from these gray areas. They're getting close to the city, and there are already what would be reconnaissance and sabotage soldier units, those DRGs, who are also there to the west, starting to probe the city directly.
la ciudad. Luego esto va también muy rápido. Desde el norte, como también señala aquí.
This is also moving very fast. From the north, as Ezequiel Bistoletti points out here, a small town, I can't remember its name now, is almost in the hands of, as you can see here, the Stavsky. Well, it's also practically in Russian hands. And as you can see, from Stavsky to Lyman, there are no more towns, neither large nor small, not even a miserable village. It's all open fields. And look here how they're advancing indeed in this gray area. Well, this gray area has already been reached by the vanguard, let's say the scouts, and also toward Lyman from this side. Lyman is going to have a lot of problems. And once Lyman falls, from that point on the problems will begin, serious ones.
Pero gordos. Ahí lo tienes.
Ah, there you have it. It's the map from Syriac. Yes, but well, the differences aren't big. Yes, but all of this is already marked in red. The previous mapper was very conservative. Unless it's documented on video, he wouldn't color it. Syriac usually shows previews of things already confirmed in reports, but still without videos. That's why all of this already shows Lyman as completely surrounded.
Tomado. Efectivamente, fijaros que aquí, en el sur de Liman, ya han entrado.
Indeed, notice that here, in the south of Liman, they've already entered. They're already in the gray zone. You can see that they're already fighting there. You can clearly see that grayish area, let's say mixed with a reddish tone, an area there, and indeed there. They've already entered the first nearby houses, and fighting is already taking place there. Moreover, Liman is a heavily battered city because it has been taken and retaken 3 times. That is, it was first taken by the Russians, then retaken by the Ukrainians, and this would be the 3rd time. So it has suffered considerable damage. One of the things we'll see later, because there's no problem with that, and that we'll notice in those changes I mentioned, from 2022 to now, is that in 2022 the cities that were under siege were completely destroyed, leveled to the last stone. Now this still happens with some, but only a few. Most of them, and even Procross we've seen images, are damaged, but not destroyed. That is, they're not like an empty lot. We're not seeing the Israeli-style approach, meaning what happened at the beginning, when precision was much lower, and what they did was, with artillery of every kind and caliber, wipe out the city with bombardments. Well, that's tremendous.
There was a drone coming back, getting inside. Oh right, sorry. Good thing we didn't show any bodies otherwise. No, none.
The only thing visible there was a drone entering, well, in another one of these cases, a drone flying through the already open doors of an armored vehicle.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, it's kind of like a Humvee, right?
Yeah, it's a kind of Humvee, yeah. Well, everything looks abandoned and all that. They ran off. I mean, they just left the vehicle there, basically dumped it. So, well, drones can get in anywhere now. This is changing warfare to a level that, honestly, neither Europeans nor Americans are ready for. The other day, there was a report in the United States that some company, I don't remember which one, had signed a contract for the coming years to produce 1 million drones. The Russians and the Chinese are doing this too, but, you know, quickly and in a rush. I mean, the gap that exists between those who are actually fighting right now and the Europeans, to the point that now, as we've said before, we have Ukrainian drone warfare instructors teaching Europeans just like that. That is, theory is one thing and practice is another. This idea of sitting here as if you were playing PlayStation with the joystick and all, oh, come on, whatever I won, oh no, they destroyed me. Yeah, but in real life, if you get destroyed once, you can't just restart the game and get more lives. No. So the ones who really know how to operate in battle, in a real battle, are the Ukrainians. That's why they have to be teaching the Europeans, who have no idea. Theirs is all theoretical. And as we were seeing here, Seversk, Also very important, Siversk is in terrible shape. So let's say the following. The Russians have kept launching attacks from the south and from the west. Sorry, from the east. From the east, they're already there. Look, in this latest advance, they're practically entering from the south, the north, and the east, moving into Siversk, and there the Ukrainians have very little defense. It's a smaller city, a city in a flat area. Look, as we said before, now the quadcopter just drops the bomb right on top of you, and we don't see as much of this anymore. Before, those fields you could see there, full of holes and craters, looked like the moon. Here we see craters, but well, this is already along a trench line. So yes, there are artillery and drone strikes and so on, but it's no longer that lunar landscape caused by thousands and thousands of artillery blasts, like we saw in 2022, for example. Yes, yes, yes. And you can tell, I mean, if you look at a city, as you can see if you pay attention, although, well, elevations in Ukraine are scarce, you can still notice that slope, small but significant in Ukrainian terms. So as you can see, once it falls, this will finally allow the Russians to align this area, which has been a real headache for them because it's taken them a huge effort to advance and finish aligning the front line, which is what's going to happen. From there, they would move westward towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. By the way, the line that connected to the logistics line has already been cut. So right now, they have a secondary supply route that reaches them via a secondary road from Sloviansk. But there we have another video of another attack.
Drones and drones and more drones.
Important. What is it destroying? A tank? No, it's destroying a car. And what we've talked about recently, why are they destroying cars? What's going on? Do they want to wipe out the Ukrainian automobile industry? No, it's because right now the troops use cars more than armored transport vehicles or trucks. Why? Because they're faster and more maneuverable. Hey, careful there, careful. That's it. No. But what I mean is that when a drone attacks you, a car has a better chance of surviving. For two reasons. One, because it's faster and more maneuverable. And two, because you can get out of it quickly. I mean, when you see the drone about to hit, in fact, many remove the doors so they can get out faster. That is, you open the door. If you don't have a door, even better. You jump out, start running, and figure it out from there. But that drone will hit the car.
This too with a lot of use, Fernando. These, what should we call them? What should we call them? Buggies.
A buggy. Yes, a buggy. They're using everything. Motorcycles, buggies, like I said, half-scrapped cars modified to go faster. Careful, that's someone blowing up, and that's no small thing. And what in terms of... Look, here you can clearly see that curved area of Siversk, which will allow that, once Siversk is taken, they can effectively advance and move into the opposite situation towards Sloviansk and finally eliminate that salient the Ukrainians had, which has been a huge headache for the Russian troops. It must be said that here the Ukrainians, the commanders who have been in this area, have handled themselves very well. That is, they've done things very well as they are, considering their disadvantage.
They've been at war here since 2014, at least, right? That's why there's also the defensive capability.
No, but especially them from Lysychansk, this thing you see here. In 2022, the Russians took this city, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, in 2022, right? And from there, the advance from Severodonetsk stalled. There they are, they got stuck in Bilohorivka, which they took, retook, lost, and took again. And they've been stuck there until this year, well, until the summer of this year, basically. They're stuck. And it's been since this summer that everything has started to move. Bilohorivka has finally been taken. which, as I said, has been quite something. It's a small village, but it has a chalk quarry or something like that with a mound and so on. Anyway, it turned out to be very complicated for them. To the north they had a wooded area, and there was no way through. Until relatively recently, just a few months ago when they started, Bilohorivka was taken. And from there they began to advance, both from the north, taking all those more wooded areas toward the west, and from the east. And then from the south, they resumed the advance, because from the south they're coming from Soledar, that is, from Bakhmut. They had a city they took earlier, a smaller one, which was Soledar, very close by. They advanced north of Soledar, up to Sako and Vantseti, a small village, and from there things had been more or less stalled. Now these advances have resumed to the point of reaching as far south as Siversk itself. So this is getting worse for the Ukrainians every day. And as I said, we're going to see how these cities keep falling one after another this winter, as is already happening. The same thing here, in Kostiantynivka, they're moving in from this direction where fighting is already taking place. From this is unpronounceable, to here they're moving. Fighting is already happening there in the southern area of Kostiantynivka. Everything points to that being the case. You can see it clearly in some drone footage, and I suppose the drone will drop something now. But anyway, well, you can see it there.
Apparently, they detected a center of, because a drone took off, so they determined that there was a drone center there, and then, well, they destroyed it remotely.
What you're pointing out is very important, because it has to be said that right now, on the battlefield, the main target is no longer a tank, not even, almost, the headquarters. The target is where the drone operators are. That's the key. In other words, finding where they're hiding or from where they're directing the drone attacks. Well, here you're going to see, look, it goes down over a bridge and so on. There's a drone and it was waiting for him. Incredible. I mean, right now, as I said, it's impossible. And look there, you can see it clearly. This is a drone. And it's not like they've made something very sophisticated here. They've taken a grenade from a grenade launcher, attached it underneath, added some system to tie it so it doesn't come loose, and when it hits something, it explodes. It's more complicated, you know?
They found a tank here and boom.
And look at what it does. Very interesting image. Where does it go? It's no longer aiming at just any part of the tank. It's targeting one of the weakest areas, which is the part between the turret. Look here, the part between the turret and the rest of the tank. That is that weaker section where the tank rotates. There, directly inside the tank. Yes, right here. Look, this is incredible. This might be some kind of electronic warfare device or something like that, but we're talking about a tiny antenna. Well, it's precise enough to hit the antenna, meaning we're no longer talking about, oh no, it can't hit small targets. Look there, with some kind of, it looked like, what do you call it, like a speaker, let's say.
Like a loudspeaker, yes, but obviously a repeater or something electronic.
But notice that it was very small, meaning it's practically a stick with a speaker, that is, and boom, they hit it. Same thing here. Well, this is the constant daily routine, morning, afternoon, and night for all Ukrainian and Russian fighters on the front line. Look, that's why the cars, because these, and you can barely even tell what they are. But when they're armored vehicles, they're slower, and no matter how much armor you put on them, okay, those protections allow the drone to hit them and for you to abandon the vehicle.
Well, what we've seen many times, the net is cast, but in the little gap, without the net, down below, my friend. And well, but even so, there's another one, right?
But hey, look, the drone came in through the window. Through the window.
This armored vehicle, in addition to the conventional armor, the factory armor, so to speak, also channels the explosion exactly onto the track, on the left side, in the rear, in a small gap. This happened despite the conventional and additional armor, everything covered, and yet the drone managed to fit through a tiny hole right into the track. The drone was completely disabled, and from there, well, one after another, until the total explosion.
See, they know perfectly well which parts of an armored vehicle or a tank are weak. So indeed, one of the weak points has always been the tank's tracks. They go for the tracks, break them, they don't destroy the tank, but they've immobilized it. From there, other drones come in and finish it off. That's why, as soon as an armored vehicle or a tank loses its tracks, it's common for the soldiers, if they can, to run away and abandon it. That's why we've often seen abandoned vehicles, for that reason. Well, this has completely changed the nature of war. It's nothing like it used to be. This, and I mentioned it briefly last Friday, has changed warfare. In an article by a Russian general, a man who has held almost every position in the Russian army but is now retired, they offered a very interesting analysis. One of the things they point out is that the situational awareness of the combatants on the battlefield has completely changed. Now there is absolute situational awareness. Everything is perceived, everything is detected, anything that moves, even a mosquito. He presents this as the end of the fog of war. Indeed. It's over. I mean, the whole fog of war thing and all that is for the users, for those of us here commenting. And even so, we already know a lot thanks to Google Maps, to this and that, to reports from one side and the other. But on the battlefield, this has disappeared. That's why you know at all times, not only where the enemy's units are, but where each soldier, each armored vehicle, each position is. That makes war completely different now, and you can't move. I mean, it's not just that you can't move large units anymore. One of the things he said is that the tank is finished. Where do you go with something like a tank when you can do the same with a drone, which will cost you much less and has much more mobility than a tank? What's leading the way now are aerial drones, that's clear. But we're already seeing significant development, which will take shape in the coming years, of ground drones. In fact, ground drones are also key to supplying these micro units, for lack of a better term, of two people holed up in an abandoned house.
Yes, according to this former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Gerasimov's position, which he left as of... Rosa, what is Ukraine saying?
Sorry, Ukrainian, yes.
He's a Russian general, yes. And Gerasimov's position, the commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces. In fact, he left, if I remember correctly, in 2008. The armed forces, in protest against a reform of the Russian armed forces between 2008 and 2012, which was widely debated depending on one's opinion. But anyway, it directly introduces a conceptual change in warfare. He characterizes it as digital warfare. And this idea of the end of the fog of war, a basic component of modern warfare, comes from one of the most famous war theorists, a German from Prussia, Karl von Clausewitz, in his famous On War, vom Kriege. He presents the concept of the fog of war in this way, and from there it has been taken up by military theorists around the world to this day. In war, the simplest things become difficult, and difficulties pile up until they form a kind of fog that covers and obscures everything. On War, Book 1, Chapter 3. Artificial intelligence helped me with the exact translation, Nebel des Krieges, in German. If that disappears, the uncertainty in war disappears. That creates a, you know everything. And, according to this man, also former commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces, he predicts that despite the development of countermeasures against drones and defensive systems, offensive drones will show a clear superiority over defensive measures from now on.
las medidas defensivas de aquí en adelante. Con lo cual, esto también determina un cambio total en
Which means this also determines a total change in the conception of war. Because from now on, we must understand it as the pursuit of greater offensive capability, much more than the attempt to respond defensively to that already qualitatively superior offensive capability. A very visible current situation is that they can't deal with the drones that attack. They can't even deal with the monitoring of the territory by the drones. They can't handle the attacks. They respond as best they can, with armored vehicles, with people shooting at the drones from anywhere. But technically they can't, neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians. And according to this man, this is going to characterize warfare from now on, which creates the need for a total rethinking of the armed forces of all countries, and in this case of Russia. Very interesting. If you want, Fernando, we can still present it in detail.
Fernando, todavía lo podemos presentar en detalle.
Yes, and include the link so that people who want to can watch it later, even though it's in Russian. You can put it anywhere, and it translates fine, I mean. Anyway, let's wrap this up, because otherwise I get sidetracked. I know I get more scattered than the troops, so let's move on, because really, this can't go on. Well, we were in Konstantinivka. Same thing there, fighting is already going on. A big city, this one really is big, but not easy to defend either. When Konstantinivka is taken, again, you see this bulge we keep seeing everywhere. It's going to straighten out. Each capture of one of these cities will mean a realignment of the front, and therefore, less front I have to attack. It's true that it also means less front for the Ukrainians to defend, but the Ukrainians have fewer men. And they have less and less, while the others have more and more, which means it benefits them, right? And we get to, well, the star of the week, which is Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, the most optimistic say it's 95% taken by the Russians. The most optimistic, huh? 95%. It's really taken. That is, when a city is captured, there are always, in fact, there was a unit here in the area north of the railway line in a district, a Ukrainian unit that had been surrounded. Well, they've already been wiped out. But okay, you still have small pockets, scattered units, which is what's called a cleanup. That is, well, yes, you have to go eliminating those small pockets, but the city is already in your hands, to the point that the Ukrainians are trying given the situation. There we also have, well, what we were saying, that is,
the vehicles are arriving, Fernando. Not just soldiers on foot anymore, but vehicles too, and the Russian soldiers seem quite calm, as a sign of the situation. One of them stumbles.
But yes, there is calm indeed. They're not there. A drone could attack or something, but not even that. This means they're already settling in and starting, in addition to that cleanup work, to consider it part of their conquered territory and to supply those units in a more regular way. Let's say, not as if they were assault units on the front line where it's almost certain death. In other words, no. This is already becoming established.
At home in the basement, no. Here in the streets with a pickup truck, walking calmly.
Exactly. And what is Zelensky trying to do? It's not going to work. Desperate and too late. The famous bulge that existed in Pokrovsk, north of Pokrovsk, has been gradually worn down by the Russians. It reached as far as the road that connected, if I remember correctly, Dobropilya with Kramatorsk. Well, that bulge that was taken in August has been reduced. There's practically no bulge left now. And they're now trying something very difficult, if not impossible, because they don't have enough units. That is, once that bulge has been worn down, they're trying to keep advancing from the north. And that's also why there's an offensive from the west against this city. What's it called? The one just above Pokrovsk, a small city that forms the other side, so to speak, of the bottleneck that has formed in that area. That's right, Rodinsky. They're trying to break through. Well, in fact, they have broken through. That is, fighting is taking place in one area of Rodinsky, and from the north, from that worn-down zone, they're trying to advance to break the encirclement and reach Mirnograd. This is an impossible task, but still. So this comes at a cost, and not just the cost of the attack at that moment on the front while trying to carry out this operation, but also because, to do it, they've had to bring in units from Volchansk, from the Lysychansk area, from other places. In other words, because they don't have any more. So every time they want to carry out an offensive or attack operation, or even a simple counterattack, they have to bring in units from elsewhere. And bringing in all those units to wear down that area and then try to, let's say, free Mirnograd from the encirclement. We'll see that there. There it is.
I'm speaking with the idea that the map is in view. No, but well, it's going to happen. Speaking from memory, my apologies. Here. No. Here the attempt of the attack. There it is. With the goal of generating access, or and from the north.
And if you go a little further north, you'll see if you move the map a bit there, a little higher up was what's left of that area. That eastern salient has already been wiped out. After many battles over many months, that salient was taken at the beginning of August. The Russians have kept advancing, and the Ukrainians dismantling that salient have now completely taken it apart. And now what they want is to move south from there to break through, together with those advancing from Rodonske, and break the encirclement. To me, this seems absolutely unfeasible.
Delusional.
Like I said, this attempt, well, it's supposed that they're sending units there by the truckload, and even pulling them from other places. What the Russians are going to do is take advantage of those areas to advance, and you can already tell, because every time they mention the units that are involved, it's a mess. In the Paracruz area right now, there's a jumble of units, meaning you've pulled whatever you could and whatever you couldn't. A company from such and such battalion, half a regiment from who knows where. Since I don't have enough people, I throw in the GUR, military intelligence, and special operations because there's no one left, and I send them there. At the same time, I pull 4 from the Azov battalion or some other one and send them here. In other words, you're pulling from where you have nothing and have to make these strange combinations of half units you've scraped together from anywhere, out of desperation. And this is becoming very clear here. When you go over the units, you say, well, this is a salad of units.
Another advance over here. Not here marked, Fernando, or marked in grey. Once again, this is a very conservative mapper, in Syriac, already coloured red. This advance like this, toward up to the pig farms.
There are 2 pig farms. So the first one is more or less taken, and the second one, well, they're testing things there. The thing is, the Russians' advance now reaches as far as Grizny. Grizny is a settlement almost next to Prokhorov and Vinograd, especially Prokhorov. Much smaller, it's a village, and from there you could say that's basically it, besides the fact that it completes the disaster for the Ukrainian units, which wouldn't even have the nearby support of that village anymore. Well, as I said, these are terrible attempts. Moreover, as we said before, the political and military leadership has given the order not to withdraw what remains here, in the pocket, and to resist until the end. That makes no sense from a military point of view. Of course, from a political point of view, and for some gentlemen who couldn't care less about their soldiers, it does. Because what Mr. Zelensky wants is to prolong the war at any cost. But even so, if it weren't for those constant requests for money and the need to show that something is being done, even if there's some success, even if it's momentary, temporary, no, we've already managed to launch a counterattack. But that counterattack is going to be crushed in no time. Well, it doesn't matter. During that counterattack, I'll go to the United States or Europe to see von der Leyen and sell it to her.
La salida de
The exit from this pit, the corridor, Fernando, is almost non-existent. A bit of Tetris over here.
Tetris por aquí.
Nada, nada, eso es. Y además, ya una zona
Nothing.
embarrada.
Nothing. That's right. And besides, it's already a muddy area. Already a muddy area, of course, a muddy area because of the weather this time of year, with drones flying overhead as we've seen, buzzing around like a swarm of wasps. In other words, getting out of here is almost impossible.
Aquí salir es casi imposible. La única opción.
The only option is to surrender. Surrenders are already happening. These images, released by the Ukrainians, show them attacking in Minograd, attacking buildings, which means the Russians are already inside the captured buildings, advancing into Minograd.
Edificios que están reventados por.
They've been damaged by external explosions. Windows shattered, bricks and window frames have fallen, but they're not destroyed, not flattened. As we said before, in Minograd, it's already clear, it's already been seen that there's still an urban structure standing. It's not like you're looking at an empty lot.
That is, it's an attack from the north, a new front for Minograd. They were already doing it from the south, from the east, and now also now.
One of the southernmost settlements has also been taken, a small village or town down there in the south.
This one here? This?
That one over there, the one that's like this one. Well, that one's taken, same as this one here, I can't remember the name. A small village. These aren't, it'll tell you here.
Lysipka.
Yes, Lysipka. That's it, Lysipka. Well, this one's already taken. Another small village over there will be taken, and from the south they'll also start moving up. But look, as we were saying, this area's been attacked. There are zones that have caught fire, that are burned, but let's say the buildings are more or less still standing. Well, not that one, the one that got hit by the bomb. I don't think it's standing. But anyway, the urban structure can still be recognized. With the troops staying there, then they just keep pounding it with bombs. Fan 3000. Look at that, my goodness, that one stuck with me.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Come on. You can even see the little fins of the bomb, right?
About the bomb, yes. And that's where it falls. And well, tremendous. The Russians didn't realize this, which is really something, until more than a year after the war started. They said, but we have a bunch of Soviet-era bombs, and if we attach a glide kit to them, like the Americans do, that would work great for us. Well, they figured it out, and now it's another one of those key elements, the ones we've talked about many times, because it allows you to bomb from a distance without the planes having to take risks. And on top of that, with the latest version we showed here, the latest modification to the glide bombs by adding a small engine, now they can reach up to 200 kilometers. So, well, this is just one more of the things we're seeing.
Obviously, Fernando, they don't want to close this pocket. No, not me. Because otherwise they would have already caused that closure, with so little space left in between. What they want is precisely the degradation of this pocket. The ultimatum today, no more offers of surrender. Either they capitulate, or total destruction. And in the meantime, they keep pounding, right?
And indeed, as I said, this has no solution for the Ukrainians. Those who haven't capitulated, who haven't surrendered, and so on. Well, what's left here, and we don't even know how much that is, since sources vary from a few hundred to a few thousand, with such a range, who knows? We'll find out when it's over, more or less. But in any case, holding on to this at all costs makes no sense, right? None at all, from a military, human, or any other point of view. Well, these are the Ukrainian leaders, and we can see how much they value their people, in this case, their fighting population. But anyway, this is a major disaster. Just south of Prokros, what we're seeing is a very rapid advance, always, as I say, in terms of a war of attrition and positions, but still a very rapid advance already of UDH was taken some time ago. Here they're advancing, but less so. They're right on the administrative border with Dnipropetrovsk. I think what they're waiting for is for things to finally stabilize, to completely take Minigrad, and for the area to settle down. Let's not forget that it used to be a Ukrainian logistics hub, and now it's going to become a Russian logistics hub, which is important. From there, once forces are freed up, they'll start advancing toward Mazova, or Mazove, depending on how you say it, but quite quickly. Ezekiel Bistoletti points that out perfectly. And another thing they've been doing in the meantime is attacking the main logistics center of this whole region, Pavlohrad. As we saw today with the bombings, they've been pounding it too. It's a bit further north. If I see it, I'll tell you. Yes, between Dnipro and that area.
Sí, entre Dnipro y esta zona.
Pavlorad.
Here, Pavlorad, I can see it now. Well, I pronounce it like that just to be sure. Let's see, sometimes they spell it with a G, other times with an H, who knows. Anyway, it looks really good, with the roads from the north, the south, the east, and the west.
Well, this is a key center.
Well, since this is a key hub, they're pounding it, because it's the main logistics center for the Ukrainians in this whole region of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and so on, even Luhansk. In other words, this is crucial, and they're pounding it, cutting off the electricity, and when the time comes, it'll be easier to assault. And from there, between Pavlohrad and what we've seen, there's practically nothing. I mean, this is what some Ukrainian deputies were complaining about, saying, but these useless people haven't even built trenches, haven't done anything, and we've got nothing. There's no front line, nothing. The only thing is to station a few soldiers in the few towns scattered around the region, and that's about it. That's why we're seeing such rapid progress. And as I said, with the liberation of Pokrovsk, many units that are currently involved in the assault on Minigrad will be able to be redeployed, I think mainly to the west, which is what's proving most advantageous for the Russians. And look, this will move in this direction. This area, as I said, is being pounded by the Russians every day, and from here, the road leads to the Dnieper. And in the south, if we go further south from here, look at the issue of the advance toward Pokrovsk. Not to be confused with Pokrovsk, we add an E to make it clear. Well, they're right at the gates. You can see it clearly. Right now, the vanguard of the Russian reconnaissance forces is already operating around the city. Another bridge destroyed, another bridge smashed.
Possibly even by the Ukrainians themselves.
By the Ukrainians, so they don't advance. Yes, yes, this is one of the things that's commonly done in war. Destroying your own bridges when the enemy is advancing, to slow down their progress. But of course, there's only one bridge left here, and thank goodness. Anyway, what I mean is that everything has been completely destroyed. You can see the bridge has collapsed, and what we're going to see is that rapid advance. They're already preparing. As soon as Pokrovsk is reached and taken, the road that connects Pokrovsk, which is an important logistical hub, with Yilipol will be cut off. I mean, they're about to cut it. I think they're just waiting for an advance toward Pokrovsk as well, so they can do it simultaneously, more or less at the same time. Ever since the capture of Vysokopilia, or whatever it's called, I mean, from here to the highway, it's not even a kilometer. There's a village that right now I think is basically waiting for the advance toward Danilivka. They're waiting for them to push further in that direction toward Pokrovsk, to cut off the highway completely from both sides. And look, Puebla is here. But we were talking on Wednesday, if I remember correctly, more or less, about the fall of Uspanivka. I think it was, yes, here. But look at the gray area. That is, Uspanivka has already been taken, and the next day they were already advancing. In other words, all this gray area has already been taken, and all of this here as well.
Todo esto gris ya se ha avanzado y todo esto de aquí también, es decir, y más al norte igual. Ya están aquí en
That is to say, and the same further north. They're already here, in this town right here, covered by They had just taken Uspenivka and were already moving forward. And Uspenivka was the main center of resistance, with a river running through it, which the Ukrainians held there. Well, from Uspenivka to Yilopole, there's nothing. There are 4 villages, but nothing else. Then we'll see that, in a very short time, the Russians will show up on the outskirts of Yilopole. And the Ukrainians have a very serious problem, because that's the main defense of the Zaporizhia area they hold on their western side. That is, on their far western side. There it is, Yilopole. The moment Yilopole falls, the disaster will be spectacular.
That's the only one. Ah, the ball.
They have one. Not Yilopole. Yilopole is supplied from Zaporizhia, but there would be one left, meaning it would take us to this Zaporizhia. But of course this already means, look, Oleyov, how bad that looks. If Yilopole is taken, Oleyov is lost, because it's not just that they'll attack you from the south, they'll also attack you from the east, even from the north.
Yes, but now, Fernando, in Uliapol, the only major road is almost blocked.
The one from the north is almost cut off, and only the one coming from Zaporizhia to the city remains.
But it's a little path over here, huh?
Yes, 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 right? That's all they've got left.
Yes.
That's all they have left. And well, that's it. But look, you can see it very clearly there. Yilopole and Oleyov. Look at the terrible position Oleyov, or Oleyip, whatever we want to call it, ends up in if Yilopole is taken. If Yilopole falls, Oleyov is lost. That is because the Russians would come at them not only from the south, but also from the east and even from the north. It's over. But even the city of Zaporizhia itself would be lost, though it would take longer, since it's on the Dnipro. That is to say, once Yilopole is taken, the race toward the Dnipro will be tremendous. You can see here they're already moving up from the south, but we already have here in blue the city of Zaporizhia. The moment Yilopole falls, then, that is, the advance will be over an area they've already surpassed, because they'll move forward from the east and northeast, let's say, towards Zaporizhia. There are no fortifications of any kind left in that part of Zaporizhia. If we look at the yellow lines, the fortifications are built to stop an advance from the south, not to stop an advance from the east and from the north. In other words, the situation here is critical. The Ukrainians themselves are saying it, right? I mean, the Ukrainians, the ones actually there fighting. When we look, you can clearly see the administrative area, the part of Zaporizhia that's on the Dnipro, around the Dnipro River, and there we can see just how dramatic the situation is for the Ukrainians. On top of that, add all the chaos caused by the destabilization, the lack of electricity. I'm telling you, this winter is going to be decisive because, look, even from yesterday to today, it's clearly becoming very difficult. This isn't something that can be solved with generators or anything like that. This happens. Diesel generators work for a specific building, but not to keep a whole city running. Like what happens, for example, with hospitals. All hospitals, here in Madrid for instance, or anywhere, have a diesel generator just in case. So if there's an outage, like the big blackout this year, well, they can keep operating and their patients won't die there. But those are isolated cases, and besides, they might have diesel for a day or two at most, not longer. In other words, yes, this situation is critical for Ukraine. For the rest of the year and into the winter, when we get to December, January, February, March, since winter lasts until the 21st or 22nd of March, the situation is going to be critical. because what we're going to see is a collapse at the front, very likely, or at least in sectors of the front that are no longer sustainable. These rapid advances are possible, as we said before, because there is no front line, no clear coordination, and what they have are units of soldiers in villages and towns, in urban areas, so to speak. In 4, even if it's a village with 4 streets, there's nothing left there to stop them from advancing. That's why the Russians are advancing so quickly in this area. Dnipro, Petrovsk, and Zaporizhia are going to be a nightmare for the Ukrainians this winter. It already is, you know? But even more so if that's possible.
Fernando, my friend, Santiago Martinez's show starts in just a couple of minutes. So let's wrap up this in-depth analysis of the situation. We just got a message from a little while ago. Ezequiel, when are you doing a program on the geopolitics of resources linked to land management policies, resource management, and real sustainability based on technical scientific models? Well, some of that has already been covered. So when do we do it? We could definitely do a special program on that. But you, Fernando, in your broadcasts, I remember some of your shows about...
Yes, well, we can do it like... I make it very focused. I mean, of course, in an hour and 15 minutes or so, we can even do a cycle, 1 per week or something like that. That is talking about these topics that are fundamental to the geography of the territory. It's not the same to wage war in the Himalayas or in Tibet, for example, which has nothing to do with Ukraine. It's not the same, indeed, when it comes to the struggle for control of energy resources and strategic minerals. If we look at it here, why was Ukraine important? Aside from hurting the Russians, it was important as a transit zone for the Russians. That's clear. Besides, Ukrainians also have gas. But anyway, we'll talk about other things later. I mean, it's always true that we focus on oil, gas, and rare earths, but there are a lot of other things. Copper, for example, there's plenty of it, but since demand is so high, it's becoming more and more of a problem. There's an increasing struggle over copper. Here in Spain, people steal it straight from cables. They cut them, and yes, because copper is becoming more and more necessary, and recycling is still insufficient. In the end, it won't be able to meet the huge demand. Even silver. Silver is essential for making microchips. All microchips contain silver. Just tiny amounts, but necessary ones. Gold too, huh? Gold as well.
Fernando, to wrap up, some images of your friend, not long ago, holding heads in his hands, severed heads. Now, the head cutter, yes, the head cutter, the former head cutter Al-Gulani, he's now in the United States, waiting for a meeting with Trump. So, instead of a head, a basketball.
He's practically managed with the heads. It's harder to knock the heads down. I mean, this part is easier. Of course, it's all about training, huh?
What I just noticed, though, there, playing basketball, he's fatter. Yeah, look at that belly. He's put on weight, living the good life. It's not the same as being a jihadist, hiding out and all that. As well, being president, even if it's a president.
Almost without territory, controlling nothing, but oh well.
At first I remember him, yes, but skinny, muscular of course, from fighting on the front lines practically in a civil war. Now he's got quite a belly.
He's almost worse off than I am, and I've already got quite a belly. Well, this man is bigger and taller.
What a world. What madness. This guy now. By the way, the other day the Security Council, with Russia and China included, decided to cancel the arrest warrant. Now, on a global scale, not just the United States, he took part the other day in a summit in Brazil, with Lula receiving him. What else can they do? Now he's accepted as the president of Syria. Not long ago, cutting off heads. The Americans, the Israelis, the Turks put him there, and now, as if nothing happened. All good. Fernando.
No, pero a ver, hay una cosa, y eso lo entiendo, ¿eh?
No, but look, there's one thing, and I get it. For example, the Russians and the Chinese, curiously, the Chinese are tougher with the head chopper. But anyway, with this one, with al-Assad. But I understand it, I mean, because one of the premises used by the BRICS and, let's say, the Global South is, well, in contrast to the constant interference by the United States, always getting involved in every mess, invading countries, overthrowing governments, we don't do that. We let each country do what it wants, even if we don't like who's in power there. That is, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. So, even if we don't like this guy, a kind of Al-Qaeda type who's a real head chopper, that's the situation and we can't interfere. Besides, there's pragmatism. Both have bases there and want to keep them. That's clear.
Good idea here from Yellow Armadillo. Why not, right?
Why not? Look, for next year we have to propose it after they don't give it to Trump.
Careful, Trump. Great candidate.
He has rivals. Maria Corina Machado, nothing anymore, ruled out. They've already given it to her. This is our candidate for next year. We need to start campaigning now so they'll give him the Nobel.
Querido Fernando, todo el mundo ahora a DMP Geopolítica.
Dear Fernando, everyone now to ADMP Geopolitics. The link is below, and it's also being broadcast here on Demoliendo Mitos for Santiago Martinez's show, titled The Silenced Collapse of the West. Fascinating. Everyone, head over there. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, 1,000 thanks. To the demolishers, both men and women, our usual gratitude. Remember, for those who haven't yet helped us with a like, please join us with a thumbs up, a like against censorship. Dear Fernando, big hug, and see you Wednesday.
See you on Wednesday. Same to you. See you later.